Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for July 11th, 2022. Today I'm going to talk about the impending collapse of the neoliberal financial empire, the world order that's been imposed especially since 1971, but with an increasing vengeance since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. What we're seeing is an unfolding of a scenario which was forecast by Lyndon LaRouche at the time that the Bretton Woods system was dismantled in 1971 by ill-advised moves by President Richard Nixon, who was advised by people like Paul Volcker and George Shultz, people operating on behalf of global financial interests that were committed to destroying sovereign nation states and imposing a global bankers' dictatorship over the world. Now, it was in August 1982, following a meeting that LaRouche had with then Mexican President Jose Lopez Portillo, that he wrote a paper called Operación Juarez, Operation Juarez. At that time, Mexico and other states of South and Central America were facing an incredible debt crisis. They couldn't pay the debt that they owed, and the International Monetary Fund, acting on behalf of the bankers that loaned the money, were demanding brutal austerity. In other words, cutting all government spending for necessary services, for investments, for infrastructure, in order to pay the debt first. Well, in Operation Juarez, LaRouche proposed a, quote, collective financial reorganization of the debt, unquote. He said we need to replace the neoliberal system, and what he proposed was, quote, a new program of investments and operating policies, unquote. At the top of his list was debt reorganization and or forgiveness. Now, what he advocated that these nations that were facing this problem should do is that if this proposal for a reorganization was rejected by the financial cartels, LaRouche urged that the governments reply, quote, try to collect the old contracts, in other words, the old debt, and you force us to default, unquote. Now, in the Operation Juarez, he said quite a bit more, but just to give you a sense of it, he blasted the way the International Monetary Fund and banks determined interest rates and exchange rates. He described this as, quote, nothing more or less than pure and simple theft on a massive scale by foreign lending institutions and others, unquote. He said that instead of submitting to these conditionalities, the continent needs a policy which will, quote, bring internal institutions of credit, currency, and banking into order as sovereign instruments designed to serve the interests of the nation, unquote, not the global bankers. And he said these should be long-term partnerships with fair pricing agreements, as opposed to what would later become the free trade, free market policies of the World Trade Organization, which he described as based upon British-style central banking. Now, Jose Lopez Portillo, the president of Mexico, responded positively to this and tried to organize an alliance of other South American governments to back him up on it. Unfortunately, at that time, the power of Wall Street and the City of London was so great that these nations were intimidated and did not act in the interests of their citizens and their sovereign countries, and instead accepted the demands of the International Monetary Fund. Now, the question that was posed by this is, what power did these nations have? LaRouche's proposal was, if you don't accept an orderly reorganization, then the alternative would be to explode what he called a debt bomb, that is, canceling the debts. And this became a discussion topic after LaRouche raised it, including a cover story on Time magazine that was titled The Debt Bomb. Now, eventually what Western bankers did, along with Western governments, they loaned more than $45 billion to pay interest on the $275 billion in loans that were coming due. Now, this required that nations, to get these loans, must accept brutal austerity. And all this did was increase their debt while kicking the proverbial can down the road. In other words, it didn't solve the problem, it worsened the problem. And this has continued as a policy orientation till today, where every crisis of this sort is met by new agreements, new austerity, new conditionalities, what was imposed by what Donald Perkins described as economic hitmen against sovereign nations. Now, this is the case today. Look at Sri Lanka, a nation of more than 22 million people, which is going through hell. It has fuel and food shortages. It's gone into default. It has people going into grocery stores in the dark to discover empty shelves. Demonstrators by the tens of thousands seized the residences of the president and the prime minister. And yesterday, President Rajapaksa resigned. Is there an alternative? What's the solution? Well, there's nothing that's proposed except more austerity in terms of making sure the debt is paid first. There are other nations in default, or heading toward default, I should say. Egypt, El Salvador, Ghana, Pakistan, Tunisia. You could actually add Ukraine to that list. Nations that don't have the income to pay the interest on the debt. There's now $237 billion due to foreign bondholders. And the increase in interest rates in the West, especially of the dollar, means that money is going to the dollar is strengthening, and that makes it harder for these countries to pay their debts. You add that to the inflation, the food and fuel shortages, and so on, and you realize it's not just poor countries in this condition. There's a strike wave in the United Kingdom as inflation crossed over 9% as of last month. Farmers are on the march all over Europe, protesting the green policies and the financial policies of the governments of the European Union. Taxi drivers and truckers in Italy are marching. Excuse me. Meanwhile, the NATO countries are continuing their thus far futile efforts to degrade the Russian economy by sacrificing the people of Ukraine in a war to defend the neoliberal system. Now, empires collapse when the effects of decades of failed policies based on failed axioms add up. They collapse when those who benefit from these failed policies refuse to change them, guaranteeing that the collapse that occurs will lead to greater misery and likely greater chaos and violence as people react to what's being done to them. Now, the question is, will we have the wisdom to listen to what LaRouche said 50 years ago after August 15th, 1971, or almost 40 years ago when he advocated the implosion of the debt bomb to deal with the crisis of Mexico and South American debt then? Will we have the wisdom to break with these policies by adopting the approach of an orderly bankruptcy reorganization and development of a new financial architecture, which includes bilateral and multilateral agreements among sovereign nations to increase trade, and sovereign nations with the right to develop their own credit and currency policies based on investments into the real physical economy? Will we act in time? Well, join us at the Schiller Institute in our call for an emergency conference to have an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods, to take LaRouche's advice from then, to break with these policies of looting and killing, and instead develop the sovereign capabilities of nations, not just to pay debt, but to guarantee a future. The question here is not paying the old debt. It's ensuring that people can live and survive in a healthy environment with a future for their children and grandchildren. And that we don't sacrifice for the corporate cartels, which are robbing us of every last shred of dignity that we have as their empire collapses. The link to the petition of the Schiller Institute will be at the bottom of the description page. If you haven't done so yet, read it, circulate it, get signatures, and join our mobilization to bring this about. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again tomorrow.